Well, as you know, we're continuing on with our Scamology series and up to Christmas. And we thought we'd start with a bit of a history lesson on our original scammer, one of the biggest ones around, Charles Ponzi, who was, so good a scammer that he actually had the scheme named after him.
Yeah, that's right, a Ponzi scheme.
Yeah, so we sort of figured it was a little bit of a naughty corner story as well, probably, although it did happen many years ago. So anyway, I found this really interesting finding out about this. I mean, I've always used the word Ponzi scheme, kind of knew that there was someone who was behind it, but I didn't really know much about it. Did you know much about it before you did
No,
the research?
I did not. I do now, though.
Yeah, so let's talk about Charles Ponzi, who his name actually wasn't Charles. His name was Carlo Pietro Giovanni Giuliano Talbano. Oh, gosh, he's got this really long name, Ponzi. And he was born in Italy on the 3rd of March in 1882, so quite a few years ago. And then he, came out to America and started his life over there. And, during that period of time, that's when the Ponzi scheme was born, or it wasn't really called that because it was named after him.
That's exactly right.
So he wasn't the first person to do this, but he was the first person to do it on such a large scale that they figured it was worthy of being named, giving it a name. So where do you want to start on this discussion, Jade?
Should we start with a little bit of a history of Charles, do you reckon?
Let's do that.
Or where should we start?
Let's do that. Well, because he wasn't exactly a reputable character before he started doing the Ponzi scheme either.
No, exactly right. So he had a bit of a hairy history before the Ponzi scheme too.
Yeah, now according to, mythology, I guess, or those who knew him, he was a very charismatic man, and people really kind of liked him a lot. But, when he came out to America, he came out with absolutely no money. I believe he was a bit of a gambler, and he lost most of his money while he was coming out to America from Italy. And apparently when he arrived in America, he had $2.50 in his pocket, which is the equivalent to about $81 now, because he'd gambled away pretty much most of his money.
Yeah, exactly right. So he did tell a reporter for the New York Times, I landed in this country with $2.50 in cash and $1 million in hopes, and those hopes never left me, which I actually found quite amusing.
That's right. Apparently he always had this ambition to make lots of money. He did a few different odd jobs while he was, getting himself settled, including one where he was working at a restaurant. He was a dishwasher. He also then got promoted to being basically a waiter, and then he got the sack because he was shortchanging the customers. Started small.
That's exactly right. So I guess he kind of had his first experience, or first saw the scheme of, the famous saying of robbing Peter to pay Paul, which would later be called a Ponzi scheme, when he was working at a bank. And so what was happening in the bank, it was called Zarossi. So Zarossi was paying 6% interest on bank deposits, which was double the going rate at the time. And of course, the bank was rapidly growing as a result of this. Charles Ponzi eventually rose to be the bank manager. However, he found out that the bank was in serious financial trouble because of bad real estate loans, and the bank was funding the interest payments not through the profit of investment, so not through a legitimate way, but by using money deposited in newly opened accounts. So basically a Ponzi scheme, you're using new money coming in to pay old, robbing Peter to pay Paul, essentially. So that's kind of where he had his first experience with
In saying
this.
that, he wasn't the one who did that.
No.
He just happened to be working in that bank. But I'm sure it helped him learn a bit as time went on. After that bank went into liquidation or collapsed or whatever you want to call it over there, he was then suddenly left without a job. I believe he had a little bit to do with the people, like the wife of the owner of the Zarossi Bank. He was sort of trying to help look after her. When I say had a bit to do with it, I think he was trying to look after her because the owner of the bank took off with all the money. And he then got caught. He apparently one day was just decided he'd go and visit one of the clients of the bank. No one was there in the office, so he went in, wrote himself a little check, forged the signature of the director of the company, and cashed the check. Now, that was for $423.58, which would have been probably a reasonable amount of money at that time, and quickly got caught.
Exactly right. So he was confronted by the police and he admitted his guilt straight up, said, "I'm guilty." He then ended up spending 3 years at St. Vincent's de Paul's Federal Penitentiary, which is located just on the outskirts of Montreal. And he did not tell his mother that he was in prison. So he actually posted her a letter stating that he had found a job as a special assistant to a prison warden while he was in there.
It's a good way of putting it, isn't it? Yeah. Once he did get released in 1911, not 2011, 1911. He then went back to US, so he was in Canada, came back to the US, and then he started straight away getting back into crime, and he was smuggling Italians illegally across the border from Canada into America, and quickly got caught again, and he ended up spending another 2 years in prison in Atlanta.
Exactly right.
I think while he was there, he met a few dodgy characters, and I mean, by then he was starting to probably realise that maybe a life of crime was not too bad for him and seemed to be the way he was going.
Exactly. So he did eventually, of course, get released from prison again, and he made his way back to Boston. So while he was at Boston, he worked at a mining camp as a nurse, and he actually came up with the idea of going to another mining camp, starting a utility there that would supply water and power and selling its stock. And during this time, there was a fellow nurse that had suffered severe burns in an accident, which Charles Ponzi didn't really know her, but volunteered for 2 major operations. And he actually donated 122 square inches, which is roughly 790 square centimetres of his skin from his back and legs, which actually resulted in some complications, and he lost his job at the mining camp.
So then he decided what he was doing, because he managed to speak quite a few languages. He spoke Italian, he spoke English. I believe he also spoke French. So he was working as an interpreter, and then he always wanted to build his own business. So he basically decided to get an office in Boston, and he started going to his little office and trying to come up with some ideas on how he could make money. And this is where his scheme came up. Now, the scheme that he came up with that would be called the Ponzi scheme was actually quite a legitimate idea. It was just how he operated it that it became a robbing Peter to pay Paul situation. So it's quite interesting. So one day he got this letter from a company in Spain that he'd been writing to probably lots of people trying to come up with ideas for things. And in it was this thing called an international reply coupon, which is an IRC, international reply coupon. Now, what that is, and I think they still have them today, to be honest, is if you, so here we are. If you want to send, so we have something we send to a customer, we want them to send it back to us. We usually send a reply paid envelope or an envelope already done for us. But if you're sending something to somewhere overseas, we can't do that because our reply paid envelope is not going to go through their postal system. You're also not allowed to send cash. So what they would do is they would buy this coupon and send that over, and then you take the coupon to the post office, that gets exchanged for a stamp, you put it on the letter and you send it back to the other country. And that sounds simple enough, but what Ponzi realised was that there was actually a thing called arbitrage between the price of buying that here and then actually in another country and exchanging it in the US. So the thing he got from Spain cost the people in Spain $4.50 to buy. And when they exchanged it in the US, it was actually exchanged for 5 cents. So there was actually a little bit of profit to do on that. And he thought, okay, that's interesting. And then you realise that in Italy, having gone through World War One and all this inflation, if he actually did the same thing in Italy and then bought an IRC in Italy and then exchanged it in the US, there was actually a 400% profit due to the difference in exchange rates and costs and prices and all that sort of stuff between the two different things. So it was kind of almost like early foreign exchange trading, to be honest.
And completely legal.
There's
legal.
nothing illegal with that. It is what's known as arbitrage. And I know when I used to work in the Reserve Bank or in the trading rooms and stuff like that, there was a desk known as arbitrage trading. It's probably more difficult to do that these days. But when technology was not as good as it is today, you could be buying something from one person and then, another person has a different price, and you're kind of just playing these two prices off each other, which is essentially what this is. So that's how the idea came to him.
Exactly right. So he seen the opportunity, and what he did was he quit his job as a translator and he wanted to execute his IRC, or International Reply Coupon, which is what they're called, scheme. He needed large capital expense to buy the IRCs at a lower performing European currency, so at the cheaper price, so he's able to sell it at the higher price. He did go around and try to borrow money from several banks, but they were not convinced, and they all refused to lend him money. So what he actually did was he set up a stock company to raise money from the general public. He also went to several of his friends in Boston, and this is where he kind of came up with his investment promise, which is something that is quite common with Ponzi schemes. So he promised his friends that he would double their investment within 90 days, and this was at a time where banks were only paying 5% annual interest. So, of course, to hear these investment promises, everybody jumped at it essentially. Some people invested and were paid as promised. So some people received $750 in interest on an initial investment of $1,250.
Now, the thing was, he actually followed through with this, and this is what's the beauty of his scheme, or why Ponzi schemes tend to work and can get so big. So because he was able to actually provide this 50% payment to the people that had initially invested, they were really wrapped with that. Like, why wouldn't you be? And, that he's honouring his word. So then they start to tell other people, and then they start to tell other people, and then more and more money comes in. So while it started off slowly with 18 people and $1,800 worth of investment, within a fairly small amount of time, he was cut up to, so by May 2020, it was up to $420,000 worth of investment. And then by June 2020, he had people investing $2.5 million into his product, which is a pretty big jump within a month.
Yeah, it's a huge amount. And that's the thing, the word spreads, especially at a time where investment returns aren't that high, when there's this new scheme going and it's going well at the beginning, people are getting their money, it spreads so quickly.
So I think the thing to remember though is when people are going, right, here's my $1,000 and now you're going to give me back $1,500. Wow, that's great. Well, what I might do is leave that $1,500 in there because you're going to give me back some more money on that. So while he was actually paying people their money if they wanted it, because he was getting more investors to give them the money and then he would use that to pay them out, a lot of people were quite happy to leave their money there.
Exactly.
And that's what a Ponzi scheme is really all about. There is actually no underlying product to it. It's literally just taking the money from another investor and using that to pay a existing investor. There is no end game to this.
Exactly right. The end game is that when no new investors are coming in and funding it and putting in that cash, that's when it all kind of dries up.
So it became quite interesting. And look, I remember watching, I've recently been watching Downton Abbey, and even in that they mentioned, that was back in the 1920s, and the guy who owns the landlord or whatever he is, the landowner, the earl or whatever he is, lord, whatever he is, he was going, oh, I hear that Ponzi's got some really good investments. So obviously it was a pretty big thing, and I'm sure lots of people were talking about it. But it got to the point where they started to question how it was possible that he was making this sort of money out of all these coupons, and how it was even possible because there weren't that many coupons around. He started to attract a bit of attention, but he was such an arrogant and confident man that he managed to deflect it most of the time. So he actually had someone try to sue him for libel and, with regard to all of this stuff he was saying. And he ended up taking them, they said some bad things about him, and he took them to court and sued them for damages. So he actually got $500,000 in damages because someone was saying some stuff about him.
Exactly right. He also had an issue with a furniture dealer. So there was a Boston furniture dealer who had given him some furniture and he couldn't actually afford to pay for it. They sued Charles Ponzi to cash in on the gold rush, of course, and the lawsuit was unsuccessful.
It was interesting his company was called the Securities Exchange Company, which I find really interesting given that the SEC is now the Securities Exchange Commission is the America's big, regulator. But anyway, so that's what his company was called, the Securities Exchange Company. He, in 1920, there was a big turning point basically on the 24th of July, 1920. Now this is pretty quickly, this all sort of happens. Article was written in in the Boston Post, which was like a major news article, talking about the Ponzi scheme and how amazing it was going and how many people were investing and they were making so much money. And apparently Ponzi was making about $250,000 a day. The returns are 50%. And that was only after 45 days. So all these, really good write-up. At the same time, in that same paper on the same page was an ad for the bank. Yeah. And what was the bank advertising?
So the bank was advertising that they were paying 5% returns annually.
So while this actually encouraged even more people to invest with him, at the same time there were a few people started to question what was going on and how it was possible for him to be making so much money. So behind the scenes there was a little bit of a investigation going on. And one of the things they did was they went to the post office to find out if there was this sort of what the trading was that was making so much money.
Exactly right. So he was definitely getting a lot of suspicion around him. He was also under investigation by the Massachusetts authorities on the day that the Boston Post had printed that article. He actually met with them and managed to divert their attention. They wanted to check his books, and he kind of, convinced them not to check his books. And he offered to stop taking money during the investigation. So his offer was temporarily calmed the suspicions of the state officials, but there were investigators at the Post that were looking into him.
Yeah, so the main one was this guy by the name of Clarence Barron, who was the financial journalist who headed the Dow Jones Company. He worked out that for the Securities Exchange Company to actually make enough money, they would have had to have invested in or made exchanges on 160 million postal reply coupons, or at least that many would have to be in circulation to be able to do this sort of thing. And what was actually in circulation was 27,000.
Exactly. So that's an immediate red flag, isn't it?
And then they also spoke to the not the Australian Post Office because they had nothing to do with the US Post Office, and they said there had been no notable increase in the number of these things happening. Apparently, the only time he did this, the amount he did it on was $60.
Yeah, I know. Crazy, isn't it?
So all of the rest of it just came from rhetoric. So when this actually came out, though, what was interesting is they put this story in, again, the Boston Post, talking about how this could not be possible and how could, all of this. And, of course, people were a bit scared about it, so they actually all went to his office to try and get their money back. Or not all of them, but quite a few of them. And what did he do?
So he actually paid them out. So he paid them out roughly $2 million in 3 days. So this was to the crowd that was at his office that was, kind of in a panic. However, there were a lot of people that he also convinced to keep their money with him. There's nothing to be worried about. Everything's okay. So many people did keep their money with him, but he did have to pay out that $2 million.
Well, the thing is, he also did it so with such no panic. Like you would imagine, if it was you in that position, you'd be having an absolute freak out. But he didn't. He actually came around and the crowd were all waiting, so he came around with donuts and food and drinks and whatever to keep them occupied while they waited to get their money. And I think that's where a lot of them just went, oh, well, obviously there's not a problem. We'll leave it with him. Then the next thing that sort of went a little bit wrong for him was he decided to hire a publicist because he wanted to get more people investing. And he hired this guy called William McMasters. And while William McMasters was meant to be getting more clients for him, he actually worked out what was going on.
Yeah, so he became quite suspicious. He also found several highly incriminating documents that indicated Charles Ponzi was, committing the robbing Peter to pay Paul. And what he did was he actually went to a former employer with this information, and he was offered $5,000 for his story, which was printed in the Post on the 2nd of August 1920.
So over the next few days, there was obviously people started to withdraw money. The banks started coming in. There was all sorts of things going on. On the 11th of August, the Post published a front page story to tell everyone about his actual earlier criminal activities, which wouldn't have helped at all. And essentially, I guess, it all just went down.
Exactly right. So it did go down. It went down pretty quickly, which isn't really too surprising. It's got to come crumbling down at some point.
So the news also brought down banks. There were 5 banks involved, so they were also brought down as well as Ponzi's company. The Ponzi investors were practically wiped out, receiving less than 30 cents in the dollar, and they lost about $20 million, which in 1920 times would have been approximately $207 million US now.
Exactly right.
So quite a lot of money. Now, the next interesting thing about it was he actually didn't go to jail for very long at all.
No, I found that quite interesting as well. When I was reading about it, I thought, oh, is that all?
So he was indicted, had federal indictments on 86 counts of mail fraud, which would have given him life in prison. But he actually managed to only receive 5 years in federal prison, and he managed to serve 3.5 years when he was released. But then he got charged again.
He sure did. So, but I mean, 3.5 years, I was quite surprised that that's all he got for this huge scheme. It's not a great deal amount of time for what he did as well.
No, not at all. So once he got released, he was immediately picked up in Massachusetts under 22 state charges for larceny. And he then said, well, I can't be charged for them because it's double jeopardy, because you can't be charged for the same crime twice. He ended up going to the federal court, and they basically said, no, this is not double jeopardy. It's different charges and different jurisdictions, and you can be charged for this again. He actually managed on the first 10 counts of larceny to get away with it. But after a couple of trials, he ended up receiving some more prison time. And he did end up going to prison again for, I'm not sure how many years it was.
He was sentenced to an additional 7 to 9 years.
That's right. And then when he was released, he got deported to Italy. He also did, in the meantime, mind you, do a whole bunch of other things. Like he tried to start up another scheme in Florida with regard to trying to sell swampland, little tiny parcels, some of which was underwater. And I found it quite interesting that he twice tried to get away from his bail conditions. One of the times he managed to get onto a boat and then told someone who he was, and they dobbed him in and got him back. So, anyway, he ended up going to Italy, then going to Brazil and dying in Brazil. But yes, famously got his scheme named after him.
Exactly. I found it quite interesting that while he was serving some time in prison, people were still writing to him asking to invest their money with him. So people were still wanting to invest money. They were sending him Christmas cards, all that kind of stuff, which I found quite interesting as well. But they did say that when he, kind of spent the later part of his life in Brazil, he was quite poor over there as well. So, it came around full circle, I guess.
Yeah. And I guess the moral to the story is, if it sounds too good to be true, it probably is. And, you know, in 1920, there's not as much technology around to know whether this is crap or not. You know, people wouldn't have been expecting this sort of thing to be happening. But in saying that, we still see Ponzi schemes happen today, and in the next few weeks we'll be talking about some of them.
Exactly right. It's super common, and like you said, Jo, if something seems too good to be true or people are promising crazy returns on investments, it's probably not right.